right? This is what we know, that objects can create other objects. We saw that through that array, array.new, and then inside array.new, we can do string.new. Right? So objects can create other objects. We're just instantiating objects all day, right? Everything in Ruby is an object. That's the second time. So the cool thing about Markdown, right? So that's what this type of file is, like .md is just a Markdown file. Is everyone kind of familiar with Markdown or no?
We've seen them, but why is it Markdown?
Okay, very good. And so the idea is that like I can write a bunch of text and I can mark it so that it adds certain highlighting to it, or it can add certain features. So like when you're on Slack, if you do something like, whoa, and you put the underscore, what does that do? Does anyone know? It just makes it like italics. That's all. And then if you wrap something in sort of the star, it makes it bold. Right? So you're like, whoa, powerful. And then that makes that whole statement sort of bold. That's all it really does. So you can mark up the text that you're writing, and that's going to have a powerful effect. And so you can preview your README to see all the changes that actually happen after the markdown happens. So for example, I'm adding these three sort of like hashes, these 3 pound signs, and then I have the world so far. In your text editors, if you want to see a preview of what it looks like, you can hit Control-Shift-M, and that's going to give you what it looks like after the markdown has sort of taken. And that is like the world so far. If I wanted it bigger, I can kind of add like less, and this is kind of like headers. So like H1, H2, H3, and then makes it a little bit smaller. I can wrap all of this in this like backtick and put Ruby to specify that everything I'm about to write is going to be essentially Ruby code. Yeah. Otherwise, just my text is just sort of regular. I think I can do objects can create, and I think this works the same. Ooh, look at that. Ooh, I guess you can't really see it, but it's like italic. But we can wrap it again. Boom! Okay, that didn't do anything. It should have made it bold. But yeah, so like that's what Markdown is for, huh?
You can't do two.
Is it 2-star?
No, you can't do like italic and bold at the same time.
You should be able to.
No, you tried to do it now.
Oh, that italics did it well? Huh, interesting. Either way, there's a lot of like different things that you can do to your Markdown file, and this can help organize your code. Yeah? When you start writing your blogs, you'll also probably want code blocks inside your blogs, and so this is like under the same thing. Like if I wanted to change this to, I'm writing a bunch of JavaScript, it's not going to recognize the same syntax, but if I put Ruby, it's going to be like, oh, this is like Ruby code, and it'll highlight appropriately. Cool. All right, so that's just like a quick aside on Markdown files, but the idea is that with whatever class it is, you can do .new, and that's how you initialize it. It's going to call the initialize method, and then sometimes there are arguments, right? That's not necessary. However, with instantiation, you're probably going to want to pass it some sort of argument, right? And that's going to run the initialize method, and that's going to line up sort of with like the instance variables. Those are the attributes of the class. So we talked a little bit about like instance variables and how they apply, and you can call them only on instances. And then class variables and how they are in scope of the class itself, and then class methods. All right, so just like a cool dummy example is like I've made this school. I made an accessor because I want to be able to read and write the attributes of name and students. And so this code doesn't work, right? Like I'm obviously missing like this end here, this syntax, like the indentation's a little bit off. So I want to talk about, again, just structure. If you remember like yesterday's lecture, you'll see that I do the same thing all the time, and that is I add certain spaces in certain places for readability, and all my adder, reader, writer, accessors are always at the top. I define all my instance methods, and then I'll define my class methods. And so these are little things that you'll pick up, but what I want to kind of show you is something called Airbnb. Have you heard of this company? It's like a small startup. They used to be a Rails app. Style guide. So we can put something like Ruby. And so Airbnb has taken it upon itself to be like, I'm such a great developer. Everyone should sort of kind of write like this. Just kidding, they're not arrogant monsters. This is a collection of sort of like best practices on how to structure your code and kind of how to write. So now that we know a little bit of Ruby, hopefully we can go through some of these examples to kind of see like what good style is. I'm not going to go over everything, but the idea is that you should be able to write code a certain way. So like indentations, right? Use soft tabs or two spaces. This is a big thing in development. I don't care what you do, please indent. Tab or spaces, it's your call. Huh? It's just like two, it's, yeah. All right, very good. Thanks rest of the people. All right. So yeah, like if you're just using like case when statements, they should be written sort of like this. If you're setting it to a variable, then you can write it like this in terms of like, that's what the indentation looks like, right? Like the case and the when don't indent. It gives you an example of what bad looks like, and it gives you an example of what good looks like. And you can see already why that is a little bit more readable, right? Like if I'm defining a method and it takes, for whatever reason, like 7, just kidding, arguments. If you put it like this, it's kind of easy to read, but this is easy to read, right? And so the language is nice in that it's what is known as space agnostic. It doesn't care that there's all of this white space here. It just looks for key tokens. It's going to see phrase ID, comma. Anything that comes after that that's a character is going to be what I'm looking for. Then it comma separates anything that's next that's a character is sort of what's important to me. So you can add all of these like new line breaks and it's not going to break your code. But again, it's about that readability. Yeah? So what else is really good? So this is a good example, and this is a good example. This is a bad example. Right? Cool. Yep. So here, this is a bad example, right? If you're doing a lot of ands, the idea is that like I can't tell quickly that all of these ands are sort of chained together. If my and statements go to the next line, I want the user to know that like, hey, this is sort of a continuation of the and statement, so I will indent. And so there's like little things where like, here's a bad way. Don't do this, but do this. I can't actually see what the difference is. Hold on. When making inline comments, all right. When you're making inline comments, notice there is no space here, but there's a space here. That's the main difference. Ooh, took me a second. Right. So in terms of like structure, style guides, Airbnb has taken it upon themselves, and thank God for them, where like these have been discussed sort of like informally, posted on Stack Overflow. Senior developers kind of talk like, you know, when you write your code, it should be like this for readability. Airbnb is actually kind of like a really good authority on like Ruby, React, JavaScript. So you can look up Airbnb style guides for React, JavaScript, stuff like that, and it'll tell you, like I would just read through it and just kind of get a good idea of like what good clean code looks like. Cool? All right, did that answer the structure question? Yeah, all right, let's move on. So the idea is that like I have this school, right? I need some sort of variable because I need a reference to it. If I don't have this variable, then the idea is that the school will in fact be instantiated, but I can never reference it on the next line. So again, variables are your friend. And right now you probably won't run into memory issues. So just, if you need reference to it later, make it a variable. Cool? All right. So just kind of like the idea of how to call the methods, right? You instantiate like this, and then this right here, because I have the capital S, I'm referring to the class, I can then call class methods on it. I can only call class methods on a class. I cannot call sort of like an instance method on a class because that kind of crosses that scope boundary. All right. You're not going to get arrested. It just won't work. Right? I didn't mean to be like so intense about it. All right. So the idea here is like I can have school, I can have student, and there's some sort of relationship between the two. And this is kind of where I want to get into this idea of like single source of truth. And that sounds like a fairly complicated topic, but here's really what it breaks down to. If I were to talk about school and student, how would you describe the relationship between a school and a student? Right, that's like an easy one, right? A student sort of belongs to a school, right? Like you all, that sounds weird. You belong to the school. No, I'm just kidding. Flatiron School owns it. No, like you belong to this school, sort of like metaphorically, right? And then a school, blank, 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 what students? It's not really that many words. Right, has many, right? A school has many students. And so that's kind of the relationship between the two objects, specifically their classes. Now, this single source of truth is kind of like, who here went to high school in New York? New York City. Okay, lost a couple. All right. Okay, no big deal. All right, so this is the idea that you go to each class, and all the teachers don't really know you, so they make you fill out this like tiny little like red card with a bunch of check boxes on it. You guys like not been in high school a long time? Okay, I know I look young. I'm like in my 30s. Nobody was surprised. All right, sure. Not as young as I look. Oh my God. I got carded the other day. It's like, I felt delightful. I was like, God bless you. Anyways, it's like over 10 years ago. I could drink. So, God. So the idea is that like you can fill out anything you want, right? So like in Cantonese, there's like a phrase called Dai Lo, which means like big boss. Or it's like typically used in slang for like the mob boss, right? Like, oh, Dai Lo, it's like sort of like the head of like the Yakuza or whatever. And so I went around like the boss of a high school student. I was like a dorky high school student. I put Dai Lo on my like attendance card because I told him that was my Chinese name. And so don't worry, this story has a point. And so my classes, all my teachers would be like, is Dai Lo here? I'd be like, yes, that's me. And all the other like Chinese people would laugh, and everyone else would be like, what's so funny? And so the point is, right, I have since matured, right? And in college, I did not do this. For whatever reason, when I was filling out my college applications, I put in like my full legal name, right? I was like, oh, it's a college application. I put Evans, real middle name, Wang. If you want to know, I'll tell you. But anyways, I put in my full name. And so college knew me as like Evans, like super awesome human being, Wang. And then high school people knew me as Dai Lo. And then elementary school students, like, you know, my friends called me stupid, whatever, right? So the point is that like where I am in terms of my name changed based on where I was. There was no sort of single source of truth to figure out what my name was, unless they like called my mom and was like, hey, I've been calling this kid Dai Lo. He's also in trouble. What's his real name? So a single source of truth, you could say, would be like my mom. If anyone asked what my name was, my mom would be like, it's Evans Wang. Whatever I said sort of was irrelevant. So the idea is that like different people can kind of know me by different names, but there's one place everyone can go to that will be like, okay, this is really it. This is the single source of truth. And so let's think about this in terms of like how we can kind of like code this, like computationally. The idea is that like if there was a database of students that followed you, right? Like, I know this is gonna sound real Big Brother, but the idea is that like, let's just say there was a database, sort of like a, I don't know, some sort of social database that tracked you by a number, might be anywhere from like potentially exactly 9 digits, you know, something like that. Huh?
Is that your object ID?
No. Oh yeah, actually yes. Oh wow, smart. The idea is that like, if every single school that ever registered you ever looked at like your social security card and was like, okay, great. Hello, how are you? Give me your social security card, which you probably shouldn't be doing, but it's fine. And they register you like Evans Wang. Everyone would have the same reference to the name Evans Wang. Now, think about this computationally, right? If for whatever reason, I'm like a great American hero, and I rat out the mob, and I put in like witness protection, which may not be true. It's not true. And I needed to change my name. And so my social security card now has a new name, right? It's something awesome that I probably should have thought of before, like Chet Tiller, right? Cool name. Let's just say my name changed to Chet Tiller, right? If this was all done digitally, theoretically, right, once I change my name in sort of like this single source of truth system, the social security system, if I walk into school the next day, record-wise, what should my name be in the record book? It should be Chet Tiller, right? Because it's following one single source of truth. And that's better because that way I'm never duplicating that data. I never have to recreate that data anywhere. It's always pulling from one location. So if I need everyone else to get this change, I only have to change it in one place. How many of you, like, your credit card's expired and you're like, okay, all right, I paid Netflix on it. And then you're thinking, like, what are all the other reoccurring bills? What if you just had a card? I'm not like pitching you on my startup idea. But what if you had a card where sort of like even if it expired, it sort of updated and let all the other vendors know, hey, my card number changed, this is a new expiration date, NBD, please continue paying for my Netflix, I like it. And so that's the single source of truth. I don't have to recreate that data anywhere else. Does that make sense? How are we feeling about that? Okay, cool. Huh? Okay, we could build that later. Let me kill the recording. All right, we're all gonna do this venture. All right, cool. So that's kind of the idea behind the single source of truth. There's one place where everything else kind of references, and if I change that one thing, everything else gets that change. So that's the idea of single source of truth. Let's talk about like this model. I'm gonna go very quickly through the definitions because let's be real, this is kind of boring. It makes more sense when put into practice and use. So a model, right? A model you could think of as just like a class. Its primary responsibility is just to store data. So an example could be like a class of school, and it just holds data. And that is like maybe all the students that are in there, the name of the school, how long the school's been there, championships it's won, whatever. The domain. You're gonna hear this a lot. The domain is what is known as like sort of like the subject matter of the problem. So if I'm trying to build like a brand new bank and I need to kind of like build out this application, what are the models that I need to solve this? So the domain is kind of like, what are the models that are involved in kind of solving the problem that I'm trying to fix? This is a very abstract concept. As we start to use the terminology more and more in many examples, it will start to make sense. But domain is just the subject matter of the problem. For domain modeling, it's thinking through, okay, what are the models that I need? And ultimately, what are the relationships between the models? So if I'm trying to build, you guys heard of like Kumon, like Mathnasium, right? Maybe some of the people that had to go to Saturday school for no reason, like know about these things. Okay, I did. The idea is like if I'm trying to build some after-school program, I need obviously teachers, I need some sort of students, and I need to establish a relationship between students and teachers, and then I need like admins, all right? But what's the relationship between like an admin and a teacher or an admin and a student? Maybe nothing, but I still need this admin model, right, that exists within my domain for my app. And so just thinking through that. Relationships, we talked about one, which is one to many, and then we'll eventually kind of bleed and get into something known as like many to many. So without really kind of going too much into it, here are some examples of like a one-to-many relationship. These, like, have you guys used the labs? Or at least got to it? Okay. What is an example of a one-to-many relationship? Huh? You don't have to read these. I'm just very subtly putting them on the screen. Huh?
I said an artist has many songs.
An artist has many
Songs.
songs. Okay, I thought you said something else, like stocks, and I was like, sorry, the WeWork IPO is on my mind, which is not something I can or should comment on a recording, and so I will leave it alone. It is happening though. That's all I can. I probably shouldn't say it either. But anyway, so okay, artist has many songs, right? So in terms of like the domain modeling, what's the relationship between artist and song, and then ultimately song and artist? Let's, while you're saying is true, right? Like do the whole thing, right? So like artist blank blank songs. Artist has many songs. And then what? Right? Each one of these songs sort of belong to an artist, right? Like, I don't know, Hello.
Adele.
I was thinking Lionel Richie, but yeah, Adele works. All right. So, yeah, there's like all sorts of things that you kind of model real life. So one of them is like an author has many books, and then a book sort of belongs to an author. Now, it kind of bleeds into the territory where in the same thing with artists and songs, you kind of have like, well, what if there's like a collab, right? And like DJ Khaled's on the track, and he's just gonna say his name for no reason. We the best. And so it becomes dicey, right? Because then like a song can have many artists, and then an artist can have many songs, which would sort of be like the next level, right? That's sort of like a many-to-many relationship. But I just want to focus on one-to-many today. And so one of my favorite ones is this like really smart is students have many labs. Okay, well that's true. It's maybe not my favorite relationship. Probably not yours either. Is squirrels? Yes. They're paying attention, I swear. Squirrels have many nests, right? And then you're thinking about something else? I don't know where you could possibly be going. Squirrels have many nests, right? But let's be real here, right? Each one of these nests, right? This squirrel has taken the careful time to pick up all these branches and build this nest. That nest 100% belongs to that squirrel, right? I don't know a lot. I probably should have fact-checked this, but I'm assuming they're very territorial, and they're like, yo, this is my nest, get out of here. And so a squirrel has many nests, right? And ultimately, each one of these nests will sort of like belong to a squirrel, right? You're just laughing. I'm like, yeah, yes, no, right? All right. Before we kind of get started, are there any other sort of like one-to-many relationships that you can kind of think of? I think one of them, it's like a real use case that's actually like true and popular is like you're building a social media app, right? Like Twitter. You have a user model, right? So the domain for Twitter would be at least user and tweets. In terms of the domain modeling, then a user can have many tweets, right? Like obviously, I mean, have you followed Kanye? And then each one of these tweets belongs to a user. Even if somebody retweets it, you know who the original author of that tweet is. And so that's kind of like a relationship right there. Does anyone else have like any one-to-many relationships that they want to maybe explore or share with the class? And it could be no. If it's no, we will either do one of two things. We will build books and authors because it's sort of, let's be real, it's basic, right? Or we could build squirrels and nests, which I'm not trying to influence you at all, but one of those is fun.
I think we should do squirrels and
Wow, powerful. No, before we get to that, we'll take a vote. But does anyone actually want to share like maybe like a one-to-many that they're thinking about, or like want to like talk it out? Dogs and bones. You're talking about like edible bones. Okay.
No, I think you meant like a dog might have like
I have a lot of bones. Yeah. But like food bones, like Nyla bones or whatever, right? Okay. Yeah. I mean, dogs are fairly territorial, right? I don't know. They like live with it. I don't know. They can share, so it may not be perfect, but the idea is that like I have a bone, right? And I give it to my dog, and my dog like loves that one bone, carries it around everywhere. I would say that sort of bone belongs to the dog. My dog is very greedy. I can go to the store and buy 4 or 5 of them. So my dog can have many bones, but each one of those, all 4, each one of them will still sort of belong to Cookies. Greedy punk. But yes, that is in fact true. Yeah. Anything else?
Teacher to student.
Teacher to student. I'm kind of hesitant with that one. So in this particular case, like in lecture, right, to like all of you, sort of like sitting in lecture, and then I'm giving you like this lecture. but let's be real, like Chet and Vera, who are like sitting right there, are also your teachers. So that might constitute more like a many-to-many relationship, right? A student can have many sort of instructors, and each one of these instructors can have many students. Like if I'm teaching mods 1 and 2.
What a dealership in cars.
A dealership in cars. You tell me.
I think a dealership is singular. So it's one.
Mm-hmm.
Has many cars.
Yep.
That's
How many brands?
Or many what?
Brands.
Rides?
Brands.
Oh, brands.
there's still cars.
Yes, but then you're telling me that, like other dealerships can't sell those brands. So that's another like many to many.
Like a person can have many cars.
A person can have many cars. Yes, absolutely. A person can have many cars, right? But each one of those cars sort of belongs to that person, unless you're like a punk high school student and you like take your dad's car out and you like tell all your friends that it's your car, and then it gets dicey. But the idea is that like the relationship can kind of get dicey, but like try thinking through, and that's why when you like say these examples, do both sides of the story, right? Like a person can have many cars, and each one of those cars should sort of belong to a person or like a car owner. Cool? All right. I know we like joked around a little bit, but how are we feeling about like this one-to-many relationship, but specifically kind of like how it's sort of different and separate from many-to-many? So like I feel like I get it, or like, it's all right.
Well, define some many to many.
Say again?
Like something, you know,
A many-to-many?
yeah, that's something that you just can't.
Have you guys heard of a company called ClassPass?
You know,
Okay, so ClassPass, basically it's like I pay for this membership, and it allows me to go to a bunch of gyms. Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. So this idea is that like a person can go to many gyms, and each one of these gyms can have many sort of like members. So you have member and you have gyms. And so that's like a many-to-many relationship. Right? Like if I wanted to, I can go to Planet Fitness, and then tomorrow I'm like, you know what, I got kicked out for the day. I was a lunk. I got to go to New York Sports Club. But yeah, I can go to different gyms, but each one of those gyms can have many sort of members. Right? Cool. How we feeling all right? I got like kind of some hands, some nods, most nods. All right, great. So let's kind of get started. What do you guys want to build today? All right, let's do this. Books and authors. Okay. Squirrels and nests. Okay, that's kind of like, I almost feel like that's by default. Something else you want to build. We went into something else, yeah. All right, let's do it. Great. Okay. Cool. Let's start with this sort of squirrel. All right. So I know that I want to create like squirrels in nests. So I need a class squirrel and I need a class nest. Right? So let's do that. I got class squirrel. Boom, boom, boom. So when I end, a quick little like end the squirrel class. Otherwise, it's very aggressive. And then naturally, I will need to at least initialize it. So what are some attributes of a squirrel?
Let's go.
Normally, people start with names, so it threw me off. Color works. Name sounds good. Sure, let's go with. Great. Any other attribute for squirrel? Size? How many? Size? Okay, sure.
Some squirrels are like big.
Flying
Flying could be a bully.
could be a Boolean, sure. All right.
Height. Another one. Oh.
Okay. So I think this is enough. Otherwise, whenever I initialize, I have to put in all the attributes. It's just gonna slow things down. We can go all day. All right, cool. So
Wait, what?
some squirrels fly, right?
Yeah, but shouldn't it be true?
only a small portion of
I
flies, so
thought
we
flying
should set
was a
that
fact.
automatically default into
False.
not.
So you're saying by default this should be false.
For after saying line 7, shouldn't it be true or false? Not line.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass in true or false as an argument.
Oh, right. Never mind. I was thinking that we should, yeah. That was-
All right, great. So kind of like what's sort of like the next steps here in terms of like building this out and all the functionality. That's right, absolutely. Nobody said it, but test. You have to like learn. Testing is your friend. So I'm just gonna drop the binding here at the end, and all I really want to do is kind of like test to see whether or not my app is working. So I'm simply going to run the Squirrel app. Cool. Boop, boop, boop. And then great. And it makes sense that I hit the binding here. There's sort of like no syntax errors. That's kind of what I'm looking for initially. And I just want to make sure it's good. So I'm just going to check Squirrel if it exists. But should nest exist? Okay, great. And that makes sense, right? That error that like, hey, there's uninitialized constant nest. So I could probably make a squirrel. And I need to make sure I have the arguments color, name, size, and flying. So what's this name of this squirrel?
Alvin.
Oh, sure. Well, you're right. It's a color first. What? Brown? Did you grow up in New York?
My last name's Brown.
Oh, your last name's Brown? That
That's unrelated.
directly correlates. All right, great. And then what's the name of this brown squirrel?
Chili.
Adam.
Jim? Chili? Adam? All right. That, I mean, I'm just taking direction from you guys. And how big is this squirrel? Are we doing numbers or are we going description?
Real big.
Okay, great. Description. Real big. Does this real big brown squirrel fly?
Yes.
Yes.
You're in charge. You're saying no, right? Do I have to put no?
No.
Oh, well, great. A lot of no's going on. Awesome. And so, like, I could see that it initialized properly, and it's good to go. Now, the problem is, huh?
What if there is a flying squirrel that's
Well,
like,
that's delightful that you asked that, because how can I reference this squirrel right now? I can't. So I should set it to a variable. Now, I want to teach you something. If I want the return value of the last command I just did, I can use underscore. So I say squirrel1, because I'm super lazy, is I'm assigning it to sort of underscore. Underscore, again, is the last return value. So if I run that and I look at S1, I'm good to go. Now, if I wanted to make a new one, a brown squirrel that also had a name of Jim Chili Adam and was real big, then ultimately I can go boop and say that now there's this other squirrel that can fly.
if we try, first of all, is that true in like IRB too? The underscore thing?
Say again?
That's not just true in that's true in any map. Like
Right.
in
Let me
IRB too, right?
let me actually explain sort of like a tiny difference between pry and IRB. So let me exit out of here. IRB is interactive Ruby. It's like a REPL, right? Read, execute, print, and loop, right? REPL. And it's just a playground, a sandbox for your Ruby. This only pulls in the standard Ruby library. So if I attempt to look at Nest, I see, okay, great, that makes sense. But if I look at Squirrel, is Squirrel the class part of the standard Ruby library? No. So this should obviously not work. However, the reason we use pry is because I want to pause the execution of the code and still write, read, execute, print, and loop my Ruby. So the fact that my code paused on line 17, everything lines 3 through 14 is technically in scope. And so that's why we want to use pry. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question though? Okay.
It's okay.
That's why I want to clarify. What's the question?
We can scrap the first question.
Okay.
If you're in a like really annoying try and you're going to the spec and you are too lazy to like comment out the spec and you just have to get through a lot of tries to get to where you want to go and then you accidentally go one too far and like quit and can you go back up on try or you just start over?
Unfortunately, pry is not what is known. What you're describing. Does everyone understand what she's asking for? Go, you heard it in the front. What you're describing is known as, and this is going to sound like sci-fi, as time travel. And that's like the term, right? Pry is not a time-traveling debugger. Yeah, it's pausing the execution. Now, what you'll learn is in certain other debuggers in the future, some can be time traveling, which can be very cool. You can actually undo actions and sort of revert back. Yeah, you're like, ooh, didn't mean to do that. And so it's time traveling. Cool. Pry is not.
So the question she asked before, I'm so curious about.
You're like, oh, time travel.
If you can use the underscore in IRB.
Oh, yes. I'm so sorry. Thank you for clarifying. Yes. Oh. IRB, can you use... I'm going to go with no. I think that is a Linux bash sort of like command. Let's find out. Ready? Boop, 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 boop. I was wrong. You can. And by wrong, I mean I was right the first time, and then when I reneged on it, I feel like a fool, yes. Okay, great.
Just a quick note, you did mention that IRB doesn't execute the code. Whenever they have in the file, I think there is no way that you can pass an IRB and then open your file to basically have the pry like function.
Yeah, in IRB you can require things.
Yeah.
Yep. And so, all right, great. So we've tested.
Sorry, just my binding pries are a lot like Russian roulette or whatever. Yeah, they don't work sometimes. They just like
Is it on the last line?
I don't know, to be honest. Like I'll place it somewhere and it won't work, and then I'll place it somewhere else. It's like I'm kind of gambling every time.
Well, it looks like
Okay, I will sort of address that in like a blanket statement, but because what you're describing is I cannot reproduce right now, and I can't do it quickly, I will talk to you offline. But as a blanket statement, remember, if I do not execute the code, the pry will never run. It pauses the execution. So if I wrap this pry in a method, and I never call the method, there's no reason for the pry to hit, and there's no reason for the code to pause. Right? In order for me to actually hit this, I would have to actually instantiate a new squirrel, because this is a instance method. So I must need an instance of the squirrel. Right? I can pass in some like dummy arguments. I'm just gonna kind of boop, 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 right? And then ultimately s1 dot method, because that's the name of the method. This is too generic. Hold on. Eat, right? Now that pry should hit. Huh? That's a good question. All right. So, so the next sort of step that I'm trying to test out is, I know that my class is sort of written well. There's no syntax errors. I can initialize it properly. But I should also be able to sort of like read or write each one of these attributes. Now, I kind of want to delve into kind of like how the code challenge is formatted. And the first thing I want to be very, very clear about is that there is no RSpec for your code challenge. It's not going to be like, great. Okay? It's not going to be like, hey, pass all these tests, and then you should be good to go. It is, however, going to ask you to build certain deliverables. So, for example, I could have something like, great, congratulations, you've just been hired by Parks and Recreation. Sorry you're not going to work with Leslie Knope. However, I need you to build an application where we can track all of the squirrels inside of our forest. And luckily for you, we had a developer come on the team. He or she started this app already and then decided to go on vacation. So we hired you, and you're going to finish the app. That is just a very long way of telling you there will be some starter code. And so the idea here is like, here are some deliverables, right? I should, right, or like we should be able to see a squirrel's name. That'll be like the deliverable to meet. There's no RSpec. So how do I test it? Right? You have to test it on your own. You'll have to use put statements, or you have to use pry, or you have to use a combination of both to make sure that it works. Exactly what I'm doing and showing you over and over and over again, just that skill sort of in lecture. And so the idea is that, like, great, how can we meet this deliverable? Well, I'll even tell you, like, hey, there's a method called name. There'll be like create a method, a instance method called name. And what this should do is be able to see a particular squirrel's name. That will be like a deliverable to meet. Okay, great. Easy. I need a method called name. Cool. I'm crushing it. Great. Let's test. I don't know what this does. All right. So let's run it. Oops. Boop, 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 boop. Great. Luckily for me, oh my goodness. All right. We're running into our first problem, right? And this will start to make sense. And that is like, I can't test unless I have what is known as like testing data. Otherwise, every time I run pry, I have to like create a brand new squirrel. It's better that I have sort of like all this data, drop the binding at the end, right? That way, I don't actually have to go inside my binding and create new squirrels every single time. I should have like a list of 3 or 4, and that way every time I run the binding, there's at least like sort of like some test data I can use to run it. So far, so good? This test data is called seed data. It has like nothing to do with squirrels and nests, but that's just what it's called, okay? And so, great, let's just create this squirrel, right? What's this like squirrel's color? Red, great. What's his name? What, Alvin? Very good. And kind of tiny. Does not fly. But let's just keep in theme here. We got blue. Right, Simon. Stop playing. Technically chipmunks, but it's okay. All right, we got green. And this is my boy, Theo. Cool. Any other squirrels? Okay. Dave was a human being. All right, so we have like these 3 squirrels, and so like let's kind of test this data. Boop, boop, boop. I'm gonna run this like Ruby file, and so the first thing is I'm gonna check S1, S2, S3. So they're all there. They're all sort of unique, and so I created this instance method on it. So can I do this? Would that be okay? No, right? No bueno, right? What would name be here for it to be okay? What would that need to be? Who says class method? Who says instance method?
Wait, for what?
For this to work.
For this to work? That won't work.
Correct. Right, I'm just trying to get you all familiar with the terminology, right? So I'm calling .name on the squirrel class, right? In order for this to work, this must be a class method. Now, obviously, here I've defined a instance method. So if I do s1.name, it should actually invoke that method. Naturally, now I'm hitting this second pry. And then what should sort of like this return? What variables do I have access to? Do I?
You don't.
I just called name again. All right? So here's the cool thing, right? You're inside the pry, and you can check things like, huh, what's this? Gasp. That's the squirrel. Powerful. So what should sort of like name actually return? What do we want name to return? All right? What do we want name to return? Right? Ideally, we want name to return Alvin. So what is Alvin as an attribute of this? I gave that away. That was bad. Alvin is like an attribute. Specifically, it's the name attribute of the squirrel. So this def name, really, what it should return is just the name attribute. But we've seen this before, and we learned it yesterday. Right? This right here is just like a getter method. So like as I read this, the first thing is like I need to create this name method, and I see that, oh, it's at name. Like, oh, I know what this is. Silly me. Boom. Right? So I don't really need this. How are we feeling about that?
Yep.
Cool. So let me test. Can I test it here right now?
No. You gotta-
Why?
Why is not caught up to me?
It is paused in the execution of my code that existed. Now that I've made changes to it, in order for me to kind of like pull in all those changes, I got to exit out of here. Okay, just kidding. You could say that. All right, and so now I have like s1.name. All right, but I want to make sure that it's not like hard coded. And the way to do that is I have to test sort of like the other things to make sure that if I do s2.name, Alvin doesn't come up again. So if I do s2.name, Simon. Okay, this is an effective test where I know that it's dynamic. I haven't hard-coded Simon for sort of everybody. This works as intended. Have I met this deliverable?
Well, here's the question. You're doing this in prime, but if you actually ran s1.name, you wouldn't get anything in the actual code, right?
What?
You would get no.
What do you mean run it in?
I think he means like on line 24.
Yeah, on line 24, if you wrote s1.name, that shouldn't return anything.
It does return.
It won't put it on the screen.
It will not print to the screen. That's correct. It will, however, run, and it will return the name attribute. That being said, have I met this deliverable? Cool. That's really it. Like you can test yourself to see like, did I meet this deliverable? So now let's kind of go to the next one. Surprise, surprise. Create a method named size. Guess what? Returns that particular s's size. Cool. All right. So how do we meet this deliverable?
Just have a memory variable size.
Right? Should I make this size method?
No.
Wow, powerful. Size. Cool. What else probably makes sense? Dropping that color in there, probably flying as well.
But what if they can learn how to fly and change?
Wow, that sounds like a great deliverable.
R. Kelly squirrel.
Great.
I don't know what
Don't worry. Don't worry. Great song, right? Cool. There's a deliverable that says, create a method. All right. Create a method named learn to fly. All right. You want to yeet that haw. And so, I'm so stupid. All right. Named learn to fly, which, all right, checks if a squirrel can fly, and if it can, then make it learn. Yeet, right? Make it learn. Cool. Let's do that. Let's think about this. The first thing you want to think about, right, and this is kind of like the thought process, is like, what's the scope, right? Should it be a class or, instance, right? Should this be a class or instance method that we're building? What makes sense in terms of like the scope of what this deliverable is?
Should be instance.
All right, who says instance? Class? Okay, cool. Yeah, instance, right? Congratulations, you're all correct. So let's do that. I need to name a method. Boop. And it's going to be called learn to fly. And this is what it does. It checks if a squirrel can fly, and if it can, then make it learn. Help me out. Help.
So we
Are
need a
you the me?
conditional.
Hmm?
We need a conditional.
Okay.
So at flying.
At flying. Right? What are we doing here? Okay, some work. Right? So if at flying equals what? Just true or like this? Boop, boop, boop.
The other one.
The Boolean? Okay,
Can't you just leave it in that line?
we'll get there. So if flying is true,
Actually, not false.
okay,
Then change it to then at flying equals true.
whoa,
Oh,
wow, you just did it. But now you have to test, right?
this is my question. the reason or difference, or why would you do one or the other of just doing @flying equals true versus self.flying equals true?
Exactly. So I wrote this because I'm literally just kind of following you all, right? You're like kind of leading me. The question is @flying or just saying flying. Why would I use one? Why would I use the other? Right? Now, I will tell you, this is like broad strokes. This is kind of like really big, like high-level programming. It has to do with like encapsulation and scope. That's a fancy way of saying I can't access these instance variables outside the class, right? Like @name doesn't exist outside the class of Squirrel. It only exists, one, within the scope of initialize, but also because it is an instance method, I can actually call it in sort of like other methods within the class. Now, the question is like flying. What normally happens here in terms of like the runtime? What do you normally see if I were to just like name a variable or something like remote? What happens on line 17 when it tries to run the code? It said undefined method or variable remote. Will that happen on line 16?
Now, yes.
Are you sure? Is flying an undefined method? Did we not define? Do we not define flying? Is flying a method that exists?
Yes.
Okay, so this will in fact run. So to answer your question, I will say if you've built the method, always call the method. Yeah? If you've built the method, just call the method. No, don't be sorry. What's up?
And is it redundant to write self.flying?
There is a debate about whether or not calling self.flying or just calling flying exists. Sometimes for readability, it makes more sense to be more explicit. However, self is what is known as implicit here. It's going to try calling the flying method. And like, what would it be calling it on though, right? Remember, objects must be sent a message to respond. So self.flying is technically exactly what's happening under the hood. This is just being more explicit.
So @flying is the same thing.
@flying is technically not the same thing. It is referring to the instance variable. And the method simply returns the instance variable. If you've built the method, use the method. Yeah? And so now we should basically kind of test this, right? If flying is false, set it to true. Cool. Great. Let me exit out of here because, again, I don't have access to that new code. I'm going to go back in. Let's take a look at S1. And I see that S1 flying is false. So S1.learn to fly. Okay. What about S1? I see that flying is somehow what? That's weird. Oh.
That's just
Because you can't.
Thank you. Right? What is this right here? I'm attempting to reassign a variable, but what do I have? See, we thought that we were good, but we definitely needed to test, right? We kind of caught something. So
Wait, if you ran that in the code without changing it first, would it give you an error? Because technically you're trying to set a value when you only have to get it.
right. This right here is doing what?
No, no. If after you define these squirrels at S1, if you did S1 and then the method learned to fly, would we get an error?
No.
I mean, now that you put it in the accessor, we're not. But
I understand what you're saying. No. So here's part 2, right? You guys are great. You guys have great questions. You're really killing like the story. Flying, again, is the method that returns the instance variable, right? Can I assign a method to a Boolean? Can you assign a method to a Boolean? So let's just say I made a method here, right? Called Wangtron. And all it does is it puts, oops, is it puts. Okay, can I get it? Yes.
Oh, it's
Yes, we can. Right? Can I do something like s1.wangtron equals to false? Would that make any sense to you? Would it? Can you assign sort of like a method to a Boolean? Like if I said now this method is no, the string no. That doesn't make any sense. So the idea here is, one, we need the accessor, we've determined that. And the second thing is, this calls the method, it returns the attribute, which is @flying, which is going to be true or false. This right here is a method that I cannot assign to a Boolean. So here is a good use case for when you would reassign the instance variable. Now, the instance variable itself, because of encapsulation, cannot be done on its own. It needs sort of that getter and setter method. Okay, how about this? We've been going for about 50 minutes. Let's take a quick break right here. Cool? All right, come up for a question. We left with this like attribute being assigned directly on line 22. All I've added is I've built the setter method. And that is flying equals to, and I'm going to put in an argument, and then @flying is equal to that argument. Now, let's take a look at line 16 very closely. And let's take a look at line 22 very closely. All right, let's go even closer. Let's go even closer. Okay, let's take a look at line 22 and take a look at line 15. If I've already built the method, it's better off just calling the method. Now, don't get wrapped around the axle about what's wrong, what's the best. Your micro optimizations in terms of things like that are so minuscule that the returns that you're going to get on that are very, 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 very little. All right. The idea is like, can you break down a problem? Can you read a deliverable? And then ultimately, can you meet that deliverable? Can you test it effectively? And then do you know how to test it? Those are the concepts that are going to really kind of pertain to like anything. Cool? All right, so let's test. Yeah, I have the adder accessor. Let me get rid of the setter since I built the adder accessor. And I'm simply going to go in there, talk to S1, learn to fly, take a look at S1. What the? What the? That was bizarre. Let's take a look at that real close. Huh. Let's bring this in. Let's do flying. Now y'all got me all twisted.
Yeah, that's how we feel.
Interesting.
I think we ran into this problem.
Yes,
Really?
we have.
Right?
Yep.
And,
Let's do this. All right, because we have to test. It doesn't call this method.
I think, well, if you do self dot, like
I have to do self dot.
self in the lab.
Oh, interesting.
yeah, I saw how.
That should work. Yeah, there we go. Huh. It doesn't implicitly call it. Weird. It should be. Because,
So does that like rewind the answer to my question?
yeah.
Where we were talking about the self was, yeah.
Okay. It's interesting. That's new. And not new, rather. I learned something. It's a good thing we're testing. Good deal. All right. So we have to actually call the accessor method by running self dot. Wow. Okay. 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 Good deal. All right. I'm going to test it again real quick, yeah. All right. So once we're inside this method, the scope of this method, self is going to be like the squirrel that called it, right? S1, S2, S3, whatever the instance called it. We're checking to see flying. This should be implicit, but will be explicit. It should be implicit, all right? And the idea is that once this is kind of called, it'll run false, and then it's going to call that accessor method. So it should hit this method, actually do the assignment, and then should be good to go.
Wait, are you losing an end in that case? But define, that's the space in between.
You're welcome. Okay. All right. There it goes. Wow. It's a good thing we tested.
Wait, so the accessor was implicit, but the reader, the getter was implicit, but the
I believe it's because when you entered the if statement, the scope very slightly changed somehow.
so true. You don't need the self on line 22.
Yeah.
But
So if you delete the if statement itself and just put flying equals true and then call the method to change it, will that
What? All right, let's not get into the weeds of this. All right. Let's not get into the weeds of this. This is fine. Let's establish these relationships, all right? That got wild. All right. So the next thing is, the idea is that, again, I'm like building this forest app, and I want to be able to see all my squirrels in the same way that I wanted to see all my dogs, right? So a deliver might be like, create a method to see all of the squirrels. Smiley face. Cool. Oh, they're gone. Is there no one? Oh, wow. Just a squid? Interesting. Okay. Create a method to see all the squirrels, right? How would we sort of approach this, and what's the thought behind this? What's the first thing we should be thinking about?
What kind of method is it?
Right. The idea is like, what kind of method is it? What's the scope of this? Should this be a class, or should this be an instance? Okay, great. So I'm going to create this. Oh, let's get rid of this, right? All right. I'm going to create a class. So again, inside the scope of squirrel, it's sort of the class. So in order to create a class method, first I'll let it know that it's the class, and then I will create the method name. So what's the name of this method where I want to see all the squirrels? All works for me? Sure. And what does this return? What's the logic? Right? So should return like, yeah, sure, a collection of all the squirrels. So now kind of like the question is like, where are all the squirrels coming from? How do we actually collect all the squirrels? Push what into an array? So what's going to really help is some of you like obviously started to realize when it comes to pair programming, if you physically are not on the keyboard and you physically cannot touch the other person's screen, using a lot of pronouns become very difficult, right? Lecture becomes very difficult unless I'm very specific. So if I'm saying something along the lines of like, if we take a look at line 28, which is a comment, and the comment is a collection of all the squirrels, rather than let's take a look at the comment and the logic, right? Like you have no idea kind of like where I'm at. And so in terms of like questions, in terms of communicating, in terms of like pairing with each other, because some of you like want to work remotely eventually, right? The idea is that like the dream is like at some point you're like, oh, I'm not feeling too good. I'm gonna work from the hizzy. Put in work from home inside Slack, and then you're good. But what if you need to pair program with somebody, right? So yeah, just in terms of like the skill, I think it's important that we like kind of like get a little bit more specific. So using like it, that, the thing, right? I'm trying to bring everyone. Like I might be able to follow you, but just bringing everyone on the same page. And so we want a collection of all the squirrels, and ultimately we talked about the fact that that's the class responsibility. So let's have a class variable kind of hold that data. And so we'll make the array. And then every single time a squirrel is created, what we'll do is we'll take that sort of class variable and we'll create the squirrel and push it immediately into that collection. Now, this self.all should then return that collection. Every time I make one, it gets pushed into this all, and now I'm just returning that all. Cool? So let's test. The idea is that I have these 3 squirrels. So theoretically, if I'm looking at the all, how many should I see? Right. So is it just like this? Is this good to go? No. And so naturally, I'm going to get this error. Right? If there's a class method, I have to call it on the class. It should be good to go. Any questions on like kind of like how that's working? Ultimately, what the difference between the class and instance and how to invoke them? Awesome. All right, so let's do this. We have the all, right? We have one cool method, and then ultimately we have like that collection. So, oops. All right, let's actually now go ahead and jump and build sort of like this nest class, right? All I'm going to do is like build this nest.rb, and I'm going to create it. Class nest and nest class. Cool. And all I'm going to do is like create this initialize method. So what are some attributes of this nest, of like a nest? Huh? Branches. I think more like location, right? It's like an attribute. Anything else?
Comfort.
Comfort?
Like how comfortable it is.
You're really thinking through this, right? Let's just put comfy, and let's just obviously just set it to true. All right. Let's not get too crazy about this, and let's test. Actually, I think if you just do, oh yeah, you can just type pry and you tab it and it'll fill it out. Yeah. All right, great. So how do I test this? Do I just run squirrel again? Just run nest. Okay. And so I'll check to see if nest exists, and then I'll need to create a brand new one. So I have new with a location and comfy. So here I'm going to put a location, and it's obviously comfy. Here. Cool? So everything seems to work. What else kind of like makes sense to test?
Does it have any squirrels? Owners.
Right, that makes sense. Cool. So let's think this through, right? We want to create some seed data. So I have like nest here, dot new, and I'll put like new yolk. Right? Classy place. So the idea is that like we establish the fact that a squirrel has many nests, right? And a nest belongs to a squirrel. How many of you have gone to like the labs that kind of like talk about establishing those relationships? Okay. Okay, very good. And that's okay. Now, let's think this through. When it comes to the nest, right, we need access to at least the attributes. So should the nest be able to just change location? Do squirrels do that? No, they don't like pick up their nest and like carry it to like a different place. That's weird. So let's just leave that as a reader, as well as the comfiness. Let's just say in this perfect world, squirrels never get attacked, and once they build their nest, it's like good to go. Now, if I'm a nest, right? This is like hypothetical. I love teaching code because you get to say things like if I'm a nest and it'd be like totally in context. Does it make sense for me to know about which squirrel I was created by? In terms of like the relationship, right? Like a nest exists, it has a location, and it has a comfiness rating. But ultimately, like who created this nest? All right. So the idea is that like the squirrel should be an attribute a squirrel should be an attribute of the nest, right? It should be tracking who basically I belong to. So let's kind of like fix this. The idea is that like, all right, I have a location, and now I need to pass it in a squirrel. We talked kind of like a little bit about this problem yesterday. Does it make sense if I put in the string Alvin? All right, because now Alvin doesn't have the ability to learn how to fly, unfortunately, because this is a string. Make sense? What I really need in here is that squirrel object. I really want this like squirrel object, and I think there's like a bunch of numbers or something, and then it's like at name, and like at flying. It's like all these sort of attributes, right? I need this squirrel object in here. So there needs to be a way for me to kind of have access to the squirrel class and the nest class at the same time. So, okay, let's just figure it out. I can, if I wanted to, sort of like take this, take my squirrel, like, all right, cool, bet, and go back to my nest and just sort of paste it in. I could do that, right? But do I want to, though? Now I've duplicated the code. I have sort of like a squirrel class here, and I have a squirrel class inside this file. So we talked about single source of truth, and that is this idea that like we have this name. Anytime it changes there, everywhere else that references it also changes at the same time. Now, the other thing that's important is known as like the single responsibility principle. I talked a little bit about it on Hashkeball, and that is one method does one thing. What we can do also, it's weird, is that each one of these files should do one thing. If I'm looking at the squirrel file, it should only contain information about the squirrel. If I'm looking at the nest file, it should only contain information about the nest. So now, what's the solution? Huh? Require squirrel? If I require squirrel in the nest class, will sort of like the nest class know about the squirrel? You guys really tired? Like lunch is hitting you? Okay. So let's do this. Let's think outside the box a little bit. The idea is that I can have, in fact, some sort of combo file where I can pull in the squirrel and the nest, and so the nest can be left alone, the squirrel can be left alone, and sort of like this this combo file is actually going to be combining both of them. So what I can do is I can do something called require relative. Have you seen this before or no? Who has seen require relative? And that's okay. So require relative, what it is it allows me to pull in code into this file. So if I wanted to pull in the nest file and I wanted to pull in the squirrel file, I have to give it what is known as the relative path. So right now inside this one-to-many folder, I have a nest file. So in the exact same directory and the exact same folder as combo, so the exact same directory, current directory, I have a nest.rb file. But Ruby knows Ruby, so we can kind of leave that alone. I also have in that exact same directory a squirrel file. So let me kind of get rid of this pry. And I'll get rid of this pry. So now in my combo file, I have access to both nest and squirrel. So let me just pull in pry. And let me also just pause the code. So now let me run this combo file. Cool. What happens when I do nest? It exists. So does squirrel. But what about your boy? No. So I've actually successfully pulled in both files. And so require relative, it takes a relative path. If, however, nest was inside something like tools, it was like in a nested folder, how would I go from combo to nest? Right. So in this current directory that Combo's in, there is another folder for Nest. So I would put in the tools folder, the Nest file exists. It's going to be relative to this file. Combo is in tools. I'm looking for the Nest file. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, if you were working on, if you wanted to just test somebody else's code as relative, could you put in like a hyperlink to their cloud or something like that?
No. Quite relative does not do that now. But that's a good question. All right, so let's actually not do that. I just wanted to show you theoretically. And so remember, that's what require relative is doing. So now I have access to both the squirrel and the nest class. How are we feeling about that? Yes? All right. So, you guys are funny. All right. Well, now what I want to do is actually, I want to be able to instantiate, and I need to create my test data. So for my squirrels, let me just move all my test data here, and then let me create some nests. So I'm going to have nest 1, nest 2, nest 3. Thank you. Whoops. Okay. All right. Ugh. What the? Ugh. Oh. All right, great. Nest.new. It needs a location, and it needs a squirrel. So let's just put like New York. Do you guys like anywhere else? I was just in Peru. Argentina. All right, wow, we've got these international squirrels in here. So the problem that we ran into is that this nest needs some sort of squirrel object and not the string. How can we pass in this squirrel object? Do we have a reference to the squirrel objects? Yeah, I'm just going to be like, great, this is going to be S1. All right, Alvin the leader gets 2, and then Simon gets 1, and then just like Luigi who gets shafted, Theodore gets nothing, right? So let's kind of test. All right, now let me run that combo file again. And let's take a look at S1, and let's take a look at nest 1 and nest 2. What you'll notice is nest 1, can you see with the highlighting? Yeah. You'll notice that with nest 1, it's the nest object, right? The location's New York, which makes sense. And then the squirrel contains the squirrel object. It's not the string. So if I do nest1.location, what will happen? I should get New York, right? What about nest1.squirrel? What's going on here? What do you mean undefined method squirrel for the nest? Right, there's no method for squirrel. Like squirrel doesn't exist, right? So let's add it. Cool. Got a test. Cool. Right, and the reason is like you got to make a lot of these mistakes, but if you test and you test thoroughly, you're gonna cover everything. Do not worry about memorization. Worry about the concepts. Worry about testing. And worry about like having things make sense. Can you write and build the logic? So s1.location. I'm sorry, nest1.location. Take a look at nest1 again. If I do nest1.squirrel, which that method now exists because I built the reader, the getter method, and there it is, the squirrel. If I take a look at the first nest, the squirrel that owns that nest, I can even check its name. I can check to see what color it is, and even whether or not that squirrel can fly. And so this is kind of like the power I was kind of talking about, where instead of passing in the string, but I pass in the object, there's so many more things that it has access to. Yeah? All right. So the problem that we were trying to figure out earlier in terms of the deliverables is like, you're thinking through, I could see all my squirrels. That's cool. Let's take a look at this nest. If we look at our test file, right, how many nests does squirrel 1 have? 2, right? Now the question is, if I gave you a deliverable and said, a squirrel needs to know how many nests they have. Great. So this would be the deliverable, right? Squirrels need to know how many nests they have. Cool. Where do we start? Well, what's the scope of this, right? Should this be for a class or for an instance? Who says instance? Class? Instance. Okay. It should be an instance method, right? A squirrel needs to know. Individual squirrels need to know about their nests. So, should this go in the nest file or the squirrel file? Who says squirrel? Nest.
But aren't you gonna have to do something in both?
Huh?
You're gonna have to do something in both probably with the method.
Possibly. Possibly. So think about it like this, right? The squirrel needs to know how many nests they have. For me, the way I'm reading this is that this falls under the responsibility of the squirrel. Right? The squirrel needs to know how many nests they have. So inside the squirrel class, I'm just going to make a method. All right? We've determined that it's an instance method, so I'm not going to start it with self.dot, which would create the class method. And now the problem is I have to learn how to name things. Right? So the idea is that like if I have s1 dot, this is going to be where the method name goes. What makes sense to you in terms of naming this method for something like I want to see all my nests? How would you name this? Find all nests? What does that imply to you?
Find my nest.
Like find my nests, right? Maybe just something as like my nests. If I do s1 dot my nests, right? Even just implicitly reading it, you can see that this only applies to s1. So if that's kind of like what it looks like when you call it, that's kind of what I'm just going to call the method. So my nests. Do you ever like understand like how we like name things? Right. All right. So what happens here? Right? How can I look and understand and see like where all my nests are?
Aren't you gonna have to store all the nests that were created in the nest class and then access them?
Yep. So the idea is this, right? How do you find anything? Like if we're playing cards and I'm like, systematically, I need you to pull out all the spades. How would you do that?
One at a time.
You have to go through all the cards, right? Sorry, I didn't mean that. That seemed really aggressive. Like, it just, you have to go through all the cards, right? You literally look at one, you're like, oh, diamond. Oh, diamond. Diamond. Diamond are forever. So you have to look through all the cards. So if I need to see, right, all of my nests, the idea is the squirrel kind of has to like go through all the nests that exists and check like, hey, is that one mine? Is that one mine? Is that one mine? Is that one mine? And then only the ones that are his, kind of like, that's what you return. That's the return value.
Can you do something like have an instance variable in squirrel and then, I guess, increment onto that from the nest class?
Increment onto that. What is that?
So that would be the instance variable within squirrel.
So what you're saying is, right?
Like at my nests.
Right,
inside
you want-
squirrel somewhere.
What you're saying is, let's create a like my nests sort of attribute,
Sure.
right?
And then in the nest, upon initialization, push in or increment onto that the squirrel's attribute.
Mm-hmm. So the point that's trying to be made is that like, what if I had like my nest as sort of like an instance variable, like as an attribute of the squirrel, so that I can kind of keep track of it. Here's the thing. If I do that, and every single time the nest gets created, I sort of add it onto it, the data for the nests gets created twice. I now have to track every single time it gets created, I have to push that data. If I remove a nest, right? Let's just say a hurricane happens, right? And the nest gets destroyed. Where do I have to delete that data? In the squirrel and in the nest. It no longer follows the single source of truth policy. If I'm looking through all the nests, right, and I only check to see the ones that are mine, the idea is that like if a nest ever gets destroyed, anytime I look through all the nests, like and that one's no longer there, that inherently I'll know whether or not that nest exists. There's one single source of truth. The nests live in the nest class, and all the nests fall under the nest class. The scroll just sort of references that. Does that make sense?
This combo, like, is that a two-way street? Like, now can you access this? Like, because you're gonna have to access squirrel within this. Like,
Yes. All right, we're gonna get to that like right now. So the idea is that like for the squirrel, right, in order to kind of meet this deliverable of my nests, right, we've talked about the logic, right? I need to look through all of the nests and then ultimately, right, determine which one of those are mine. That's kind of like the logic behind it. So the first thing is, do I have access to all the nests right now? No, so let's build that real quick, right? We kind of know how this works, and that is there's some sort of class variable. You can name them anything you want, like all the nests. I'm just going to use all here. And then I know that every time I make one, I'm going to push it in. And then I have to create that class getter method to sort of access this. And so if it's a class method, I'm going to prepend it with self. And then I'm going to call all. And that's simply just going to return the class method. So now I should have access to all the nests. Let's actually test that. So I run the combo. If I do nest.all, I see all the nests. Yeah? All right. So in the squirrel, I want to look through all my nests. Do I have access to all the nests now? Yeah, through nest.all. And so nest.all returns what type of data structure? Everything in Ruby is an object, so that you're not wrong. What type of data structure is this? Right, it's an array. So I know that I have the array methods available to me. So nest.all, just by default, I'm thinking like, okay, great, I'm gonna just drop a quick each. And what are each of these things? X? Right, each of these is a nest object. So thinking through that, I need to do something in here. And that is, I'm going to look through all the nests, right? So 37, 38 are sort of like the exact translation of that pseudocode. And then let's take a look at 41. Which one of these are mine? Well, if I don't know what to do, I don't know kind of like what the next steps are, I can test that. I can just pause it and just be like, all right, it's kind of like where I'm at. I don't know what the next steps are, but let's figure it out together. So in order for me to hit this, this is a instance method, must be called on a squirrel. So if I'm running the combo file, I take a look at S1, and I do S1.myNests, I'm going to hit that binding pry. The process in terms of like debugging is always going to be like, what do I have access to? So the first thing I want to do is like, all right, I have access to something called nest. Let me check to see what that is. So, okay, it's a nest object. All right. Which one of these are mine? So if I'm looking at the nest object and I'm trying to figure out, I'm the squirrel, how can I compare like me against the nest's squirrel? Do I have access to the nest's squirrel? Right, through nest.squirrel. That gives me the squirrel object. Do I have access to me sort of in this scenario? Yeah, through self, right? So really what I'm trying to compare is whether or not that nest squirrel is me. Oh, just kidding. Ooh, wow. Right? That's really kind of like the logic there. And so is it me in this case? Well, let's find out, right? Well, what is self right now? Interesting. So what is nest.squirrel double equals to self? Well, what should that return? True. So I am, in fact, the squirrel that owns that nest. If I hit exit, remember what exit does, right? It goes through the next iteration. So if I hit exit, and now I check the nest, this is actually the second nest. You could see it. It's Peru. So that nests squirrel. Is that me? That's right, because Alvin was greedy and actually owns the first two nests. It's also World Traveler, New York, and Peru. And so if I hit exit, I'm now going to go to the third nest. If I check that, what should happen? Right, because Simon made this nest. So I know that this logic is like kind of working. So how can I translate it? Well, directly, nest.squirrel. Check to see if it's equal to me. The last thing we want to do is we want to test. I'm going to move you a little forward, and that is each the correct iterator here? Each is always going to return the original array. So what are we really looking for? Should we map it?
Select.
Who says select? Why select?
That's going to return wherever that condition is true.
Right, the idea is that I only want to select the ones where I, me, self, is the nest's squirrel. So let's test now, right? If I kind of go through this, if I do s1.mynests, I should see how many? All right, what about s2.mynests? 1, and then ultimately s3 is homeless, right? And so that's sort of like the logic. I've successfully tested this method. I know I'm meeting that deliverable. I'm good to go. I can move on to the next level.
But why wouldn't you use find instead of select?
What does find return? Only the first one, right? And so if I use find and I'm S1, I will only ever get back one nest.
So what exactly is, I mean, the comparison, right? When you have two strings, you understand what exactly is looking for. When you do self and nest, what exactly is it comparing it to?
It's just the two objects.
What in the two objects is telling you?
The objects are exactly the same. They have the exact same object ID.
So it's just checking if that object lives within that object?
It's checking to see if those objects are the same. The double equal is the comparator. It's just comparing whether or not this squirrel object inside the nest is equal to me, the squirrel object.
So it's just checking the squirrel portion.
Yes. Okay, so any questions on kind of like how we kind of thought through the logic and ultimately met this deliverable? All right, I'm gonna kill it right here. Let's go over, let's kind of like the notes to see if we can understand a little bit better. All right, how are we feeling sort of a little bit better about self? All right, who has like any additional questions that may not have particularly been addressed or answered about self? Right, we use self in a couple ways, right, to indicate whether or not it's a class method, or inside the instance method, self will refer to the instance, as we've seen sort of right here. Inside the instance method, self will refer to that instance. And so we saw it work with s1.mynest, s2.mynest, and s3.mynest. All right, structure-wise, we went over like sort of the style guides and ultimately like indentation, right? At is an instance. We went down a wild rabbit hole with this and kind of like when to use it, when it works. We've ultimately determined that you have to be explicit in regards to like the self calling the accessor method. Cool. Otherwise, you can do that sort of direct assignment. Setter versus, I think we talked about that as well. Yeah. That was that. Yeah. And it's sort of like naming and scope. All right, I don't really fully remember this question.
It's, when you define like a method called name, right?
Yeah.
You do like def name that takes an argument.
Yeah.
You also call it name, right?
Yes.
For example.
You don't have to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, like if I wanted to, like at color, if I didn't want to use this, all right, I could have defined a method called, I don't know, boogeyman, and it just returns at name. So anytime on the bottom I do like s1.boogeyman, it gives me the squirrel's name. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. All right,
Do
let
you
me.
recommend keeping the names the same, or
I recommend having them match only so that you can use the macros. Okay? All right, cool. So, again, quick summary, right? Cool. We implemented this like one-to-many sort of relationship. We barely scratched the surface, but the idea is that a squirrel can kind of look through another class because they're related. There's so much more, but I want to leave the lecture with sort of like this note, and we'll end like right on time at like 4:30. And the idea is that, what about a nest? Like if I was a nest, right? What can I do? Like what would make sense in regards to like a relationship between the squirrel?
I can change owners.
Change what?
Change owners.
Owners? Okay, sure.
You know who your owner is.
Yeah, right? Like a deliverable could very easily be like a nest should know which squirrel it's in. Cool. Or if I'm a nest, what else can I do? What would make sense to you?
No, but like, get my
Right. Small things, right? Like I should know my location. I should know my squirrel. I should know whether or not it's comfy. Something like that. Okay.
Oh, ahead of the master.
What?
Bench.
Very good. Very good. All right. We'll talk more about like what Nest can do inside the many-to-many relationship, but ultimately this is sort of like what the relationship is. One class can kind of call on another class, and those objects can be related. Now, if I had a lot more seed data, I had a lot more test data, and I had like, say, Alvin had like 19 nests, and only 6 of them were comfy. Can you create a method or think through the logic where, you know, you're coming home from a long day at work, you're a squirrel, and you're like, I don't want to go to the uncomfy ones. I only want to go to the comfy ones. Right? Can you create a method that's like all my comfy nests? Sort of like what sort of is the logic behind that, and how would you do it? Who feels comfortable like I can build that feature and I can meet that deliverable? Oh no, comfy's a Boolean. It's just right here. Yeah. Who feels comfortable being able to build this? All right, let's just think through the logic. We're not going to build it. But again, what's the scope of this? Class or instance? Instance, right? So we know that. That's good. All right, what do we want to name this method? Right, so like comfy nests. Cool. So far, so good. We're crushing it. Now, what's the logic but inside the comfy nests? Right?
get all my
So there's some sort of like if comfy, we know that, that's coming up. But what do I need to look through? Should I look through every single nest that exists? Right, I need to look through all of my nests and figure out which one is comfy. If only we had access to all of my nests. I think that'd be very helpful. The next thing is, once you go through all of your nests, what are you really doing there? Are we using .each?
No.
We're going to use select, right? So like, I'm going to select the ones where the nest maybe .comfy, or the nest if the .comfy of the nest, right, is true. Okay, that took 8 seconds, right? How are we feeling? And that's really about it, right? It might be like 9, 10 of these deliverables. That's all I'm going to ask you to do. There's no RSpec, but that's sort of like establishing those relationships and then building on those methods. Cool? All right, are there any other burning questions, sort of like establishing these relationships and kind of creating these 2 classes?
Quick question. When you call you would just call my nest and that one, and it would know that it's self.
Yes.
You don't have to explicitly say self, not my nest.
You shouldn't have to know. Okay, great. That's all I have for you today.